I'm here with an old friend of mine, Dan Senor. He is the author of the New York Times-bestselling book, The Genius of Israel, The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. He's also the host of the Call Me Back podcast. He's other New York Times bestseller, Startup Nation, The Story of Israel's Economic Miracle, which has been translated into 30 languages. I'm excited to talk to him. How are you, Mr. Senor?
Donny, it's great to be with you. I must say I am a big fan not only of your podcast but your voice since October 7th. I mean, I've always been fond of you and your voice, but I think I've appreciated how much you've stuck your neck out on some of the causes and issues we share and are jointly concerned about since October 7th. It's been very important to hear from people like you really being out there. So thank you.
I want to get into some just topical stuff. Look, one thing you're going to have to give Trump, he's certainly going to be good for Israel. I felt the Democrats would have, Israel was going to be fine either way, but his initial appointees certainly point to a very, very pro-Israel position.
Yeah, I think if you just go appointee by appointee, and I'll discuss them in the order in which they've been announced. So Elise Stefanik at the UN, I am somewhat skeptical that major reform can happen at the United Nations. But what is very important about the United Nations is to have an American voice there that can use it as a platform to confront, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to call the jackals at the UN. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, more than anybody, when he was ambassador to the UN, really captured how anti-Semitic the institution had become. And what has been very important, whether it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Jeane Kirkpatrick during the Reagan years or Nikki Haley during the first Trump administration or now Elise Stefanik now, is to have someone there who can just put a spotlight on the absurdities that come out of that institution. And we see them every day, not the least of which somehow all of the UN's energy and focus over the last year has been criticizing, condemning, beating up, attempting punitive actions against Israel for how Israel has responded in what is for Israel a defensive war in Gaza. And so just having an American official that can just like scream from the hilltops and say, do you see what's going on here? Do you see the utter hypocrisy and outright anti-Semitism? And I think Stefanik, regardless of what you may think of her positions on other issues.
I'm not a fan of her other politics,
saw her
but
leadership,
in this area, I'm happy to have her there,
Yeah. But if you saw her at that hearing at the Education Committee,
she was great.
Last year, where she just held to account the president.
That was her breakthrough moment. That was her breakthrough moment, yes.
And I think she could be doing that all day long at the UN. Then you take Mike Waltz, experienced congressman from Florida, longtime military veteran, served over 2 decades in the military, actually got his career started. People don't appreciate this as a counterterrorism policy advisor in the vice president's office for Dick Cheney in the Bush 43 administration. And very hawkish, very pro-Israel, very tough on Iran, if you just look at his record in the House, very tough also on China. So that's going to be the president's national security advisor. And then you go to
Huckabee,
what is expected to be his Secretary of State announcement.
Rubio. Okay,
we'll get to Huckabee in a second. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is very much similar to Waltz, really outspoken since he was elected to the Senate, almost a decade and a half ago. Has made the Middle East a real focus of his and speaks with real moral clarity and has used his perches on various committees, whether it was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the last few years he's been chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, has been way out there in what I would say is a very good way. The Huckabee appointment to me is particularly interesting.
Ambassador to Israel.
Yeah, ambassador to Israel, because Huckabee is known for many things, not the least of which is his deep ties with the evangelical Christian community here in the United States, which is a big demographic. And while a lot of attention is focused on that demographic's passion for issues around life and abortion and, opposition to Roe and other social issues, another one of that community's top issues, it gets less attention, over the last decade or so has been support for Israel. They have been organizing at a grassroots level, their support for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. So there's this tendency to think about Israel as only an issue of relevance to the American Jewish community, but the reality is there's a big swath of the non-Jewish American electorate that cares about this issue, and having Huckabee, who speaks about Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship and America's and Israel's shared values through the lens not as a Jew but as a Christian, I think it was a very interesting pick. And then most recently, Pete Hegseth, who has been appointed Secretary of Defense, or announced that he'll be appointed Secretary of Defense. I think we're still learning more about how that process will go, that confirmation process, because there are some figures raising noises about it. But leaving aside the debate, which some are pointing to, about whether or not he's quote unquote qualified for the job, and again, I'll leave that for others to debate, and there'll be hearings. But just look at his positions that he has articulated with regard to Israel, and you just see a very clear line from the announcement of Stefanik through Waltz, Rubio, Huckabee, and Hegseth. And what you see is just this very direct line of, emphatic, unapologetic support and deepening of ties between the U.S. and Israel.
It's interesting. And no crazy picks. I mean, the Secretary of Defense, you could argue, is a little bit out there. But look, nobody's been more critical of Trump than me, but so far so good, particularly obviously as it relates to Israel. It's interesting. I had to defend myself a lot with a lot of my Jewish friends voting for Harris. I was never a big fan of where the Democrats are, but I still am afraid of Trump. Interestingly enough, still about 70% of Jews voted for Harris. I thought he was going to make even more inroads. He did in New York, but nationally, Jews still stuck on the Democratic side. Were you surprised on that?
Well, I'm not surprised, only because I think in areas that had real electoral impact, I think the numbers were much higher. So yes, on balance, based on what we know, and of course these early exit polls are constantly getting adjusted. So it's going to take a little time for us to have more precise data. So what we know so far is something like 70%, as you said, voted for Harris. But when you start then drilling down into certain geographies, so let's take Pennsylvania, for example. So Pennsylvania, as you know, battleground state, there was no way Harris could win the presidency without winning Pennsylvania. And I spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania during this last election because a close friend of mine, Dave McCormick, was running for the Senate, this race he won. And I would go to do events for him in the Jewish community. So I would speak at events with him in the Jewish community. So I did 2 events in Philadelphia. I did 1 event in Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh event was as recent as a couple of weeks ago. So this was one of the most eye-opening experiences for me in politics, because I've been involved in Republican politics for 30 plus years, and I've always dealt with a Jewish community that was by and large very hostile to the Republican Party and Republican candidates. So I go to speak at these events. Hundreds of people would show up at each one, and Dave and I would each talk. We'd have a conversation. We'd take some questions, and at the end of the event, as you know, having spoken at events, all these people come up to you and they have the very specific questions, or they want to kibitz with you or meet you or whatever. So I would chat with these people who just showed up, and I'd say, I said, well, what brought you to this event? And they said, well, I wanted to learn more. I'm thinking about voting for McCormick. And I said, really? I said, so did you vote in the last presidential election? They said, yeah. I said, well, who did you vote for? Joe Biden. And what about in 2016? Who'd you vote for? Hillary Clinton. Interesting. And so here you are at an event for a Republican Senate candidate. I didn't ask them who they were planning to vote for president, but I said, is this the first time you've ever attended a Republican event? Yes. So I was struck in a geography like Pennsylvania and these communities, and most of the Jewish community in Pennsylvania is centered around Philly, those areas I just described. Yeah. And these were people that were coming out, and they were up for grabs.
Look, there were a lot of single issue voters who just said, look, this is all that matters to me.
Right.
I always explained.
But hold on. But let me just say one thing. If you take Pennsylvania, okay, I just want to. So there, based on previous elections, there's an estimate about 350,000 ish, give or take, Jewish voters in Pennsylvania, and out of say 7 to 8, somewhere in the range of 7 to 8 million voters. So if you look at Trump won Pennsylvania in 2016 by about 11,000 plus votes, Biden won Pennsylvania in 2020 with about 100,000 votes. So you're talking about a very
Sure.
narrow band that can
Yeah.
swing Pennsylvania, right? So if some small
Yes, sure.
percentage of voters went from going Hillary and Biden to Trump and McCormick in a very close election in a battleground state, they could have
Yes.
outsized impact. So you're right about the
hmm
national numbers. But when you start drilling down, I think we're going to see the same thing in Michigan, where there's a big Jewish community, in Oakland County, a
Sure.
little bit in Wayne
Birmingham.
County. Again, in these states that were close and went Trump, I think as we
You might
learn
see a
more,
higher
you're going to see
Interesting. We'll
outsized.
see. We'll see that. Let's
Right.
get to the book.
Yeah.
The Genius of Israel, the surprising resilience of a divided nation in a turbulent world. You basically tell of a country that, despite every odds against them, everything stacked against them, they are one of the happiest countries in the world. They're one of the most thriving countries in the world. They are pushing forward on just about every area of technology. And this is a country that should be on its back heels. And even right now, still moving forward.
Yeah, when the book came out, it was quite curious timing. The book was released in November, the November after October 7th, which was not intentional at all. And it's a book, as you say, about Israeli resilience. And the New York Times review of the book, which was a pretty tough review of the book, basically said Israel has just experienced the worst year in its history between what happened before October 7th, which was the judicial reform debate, which seemed to tear this country apart, and then obviously October 7th. So the reviewer in the New York Times said it's The Genius of Israel is about like the worst timed book for that title, given what Israel's just been through. But he said, if Israel manages to pull itself out of this period and demonstrates that it has real resilience, this book will have explained why. Meaning, this book explains how Israelis are so resilient. And I'll point to a few factors. One, Israeli politics is polarized. There's no doubt that Israelis
because we're
are
not polarized at all. Yeah.
Right. So our point is, every society, every political society, every Western democracy has gone through immense political polarization over the last couple decades. We can debate all day long why that is. So Israel's not immune to political polarization. What Israel has that I fear America does not have is Israel has guardrails. Israel has what we call in the book societal shock absorbers, that even as things get so polarized, the country, the population, even when they're at each other's political throats, holds together. So what holds them together? One, I think the role of some kind of national service, compulsory national service. Now, there's a big debate in Israel whether or not there's one segment of the society, one Jewish segment, the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, that are largely exempt. Israel's going through a debate right now whether or not they should be exempt. I think it's a healthy debate. But outside of that community, the overwhelming majority of Israelis serve in the military for a period of time when they graduate high school. Males for 3 years, females for 2 years, unless they go on into officer training corps or they serve in one of the elite units. And it's, you have sons of, tech billionaires and sons of cab drivers sitting there serving together from the bustling areas of Tel Aviv to the, struggling communities in the periphery, to like all walks of life, up and down, all across the socio-economic spectrum, serving together. So there is less in Israel of viewing fellow citizens as the other. With the way we live here in the U.S., it's really easy to think of people who don't live our lives as the other. In Israel, there's much less of that. They may disagree with people from other demographics,
of course, they're
but they're
bound
not
together
they're
by
not
survival.
like exhibits.
I mean, it's just that there's a shared.
Yeah.
We got to hold each other no matter how much we disagree with each other. There's only 9 million of us, and we're getting attacked from every which way throughout history. So we can agree to disagree, and we're all still on the same side.
Exactly. And then two other factors I'd point to are, one, the role of ritual in Israeli society. So what do I mean by ritual? There are religious rituals, and then there are non-religious very just secular civic rituals, but they play a big role in Israeli life. So religious ritual, which the Shabbat, the Sabbath, I'll just pick one, the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish calendar. Every Friday night in Israel, they have what we call in the book the equivalent of a Thanksgiving every week. Most of the country basically shuts down, whether you're a religious Jew or secular Jew, more secular Jews in Israel than deeply religiously observant Jews, but they all slow down on Friday nights. They have some semblance of a traditional family-oriented Shabbat, Sabbath dinner. They are with family, often 2, 3, sometimes 4 generations, and there's just this sense. I ask Americans when we're researching this book, I would say, can you describe an event? I say this all the time. I say to Americans, can you describe an event where the whole country slows down, and one day where everyone knows you're with your family and everyone you know is with their family, and it's just like it's sacrosanct. And everybody always says Thanksgiving. That's when I describe this, I say great. I said, now give me a second one. You just described one day in the American calendar. Now give me a second day. And then they typically pause, scratch their heads, and then the only other day they can say, where I say it's a national, there's like a national ritual, and they always point to the Super Bowl, which is kind of funny. Not funny for me because I'm a New York Jets fan.
No, that's not funny at all.
But
funny about that.
Yeah. But they always say the Super Bowl, that's something where like there's an experience where the whole country slows down, does something that like the next day, no matter who you're talking to at the water cooler or your kids are talking to at school, that they all are talking about the same thing. I said, in Israel, you have that every Friday night. Every Friday night you have that. So I think that keeps people grounded.
I didn't know that.
With family, friends, with community. Yeah. And it slows the place down. And then other rituals, like they take rituals very seriously. So they take Memorial Day and Independence Day very seriously. We describe it in the book. In Israel's Memorial Day, there's a siren that goes off, an air raid siren that goes off across the country for 2 minutes. And the whole country stops for those 2 minutes. They get out of restaurants, they get out of classrooms, they get out of office buildings, they get out of cars. You can just see like pictures of thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the highway just getting out of their cars and standing there. And they all participate in this collective moment of where they're thinking about loved ones, family, friends, teachers, students, siblings, kids who've been lost in battle. And it's also like a collective experience where they're thinking about the country. And then what Israel does is they have their Memorial Day back to back with Independence Day. So it goes from this somber Memorial Day into Independence Day, which is very celebratory. But the sense is you don't get the Independence Day without the Memorial Day, meaning we don't get to celebrate our independence and without honoring those who gave us this independence. And these rituals are just universally observed. When I have Israeli friends here, Donny, who are here during Memorial Day, our Memorial Day, they ask me questions like, what on earth is a Memorial Day sale? they like cannot believe that there's like a commercial, there's like that we've managed to commercialize what they think in a sense, in a secular sense, in a civic sense, is one of the most holiest days of the year, which is honoring and remembering those who have fallen. And so we've, I think, lost a large sense of these rituals. And in Israel, they're very intense, they're very meaningful. And so Israelis have a sense of country. They have a sense of the national project. They have a sense that they're all part of the national project. And I think all that gives them meaning. It gives them meaning. There are all these happiness experts these days. And I'm friends with, a lot of them. This woman, Santos, who runs this thing called the Happiness Lab. There's Arthur Brooks at Harvard Business School. It's the most popular class on happiness. There's all these happiness guys. I love it all. It's great stuff. But if you drill down to what they're basically saying, it's not really happiness that they're talking about. They're talking about meaning. People feeling that they're living.
George Bernard Shaw, his famous
and
quote,
meaning gives them
life with purpose.
Right. Life with purpose. And Israelis, through these rituals that I'm describing and a sense of groundedness that they're about part of something larger than themselves, I think gives them meaning and purpose. And that, more than anything, I think gets them through horrendous times, like the shattering of Israeli society that Israelis have been living with since October 7th.
Great. is part we I've talked a lot about anti-Semitism, and is part of it that that because they're so successful, Israel has been so successful, and Jews through history have been a more affluent group. I'm generalizing, but is that where some of the anti-Semitism comes from? I know it's a tough one. It's
hard to know. No. It's hard to know because the problem is when Jews have been successful, they've been the targets of anti-Semitism.
It's true.
But when they have not been distinguished as being successful, meaning when they've been thriving in capitalist societies, they have been blamed often by the communists, and the communists have blamed the Jews, the Jewish bankers, the Jewish money pushers, money launderers. But then when Jews have lived in more communist-like societies and been normal participants and haven't been any more successful than anybody else, they're blamed for other factors. It's like it's the most shape-shifting form of discrimination. That it just one of the reasons we call it the oldest hatred is because no matter what the circumstances, Jews have been blamed for whatever is perceived as the source of the problems in that society at that time. And so it's like Jews can never win because they're always the problem. And I think there are two themes that always emerge with regard to anti-Semitism. And I will say, like this last year, and I'm sure the same, I know the same has been for you because I've heard you talk about it, has been it's been jarring because you think anti-Semitism is something from another era.
That's what threw everybody. That it was always over there. We read the horrible stories about the Holocaust, and then it just this is 80 years later, but it's still in the ether,
So my 16-year-old, we were in Israel. Campbell and I were in Israel twice. She and I were there once. I was there twice, and then after October 7th, and then we took our kids there, and I think it was April during Passover, last April, and it was the first time my kids had been there since October 7th. And we went down south and we visited the kibbutzim that had, kibbutz near Oz. We went to the Nova Music Festival site. We spent time with hostage families. I mean, everything you would expect. And it's no matter how many times I've been there, I've now been there many times. It's just so
overwhelming,
jarring. And so at the end of the day, when we went down there with our kids, I said to them, so what struck you most? What had the biggest impression on you? And my 16-year-old said, I know this is going to sound strange, but, and what he was referring to is the summer before that, we went with my mother, who's a Holocaust survivor, now 86 years old. She lives in Jerusalem. We went with my mother and my one of my sisters and all our kids. So about 15 of us went with her to her hometown in Slovakia, in Košice, Slovakia, where she was driven out by the Nazis. Her father was killed in Auschwitz. She and her mother were on the run. She ultimately survived. We went there. We went to her hometown. We went to Auschwitz, where her father was killed. We went to all these places. And my son said, you remember when Savta, they call her Savta, which is grandmother in Hebrew. He said, you remember when we went with Savta to Auschwitz? And I said, yeah. And he said, I found today harder, meaning going to southern Israel,
because it's today.
Seeing what
it's today.
Than when we went with Savta to Auschwitz. And I asked him why. And he said, it's a version of what you just said. He said, I imagined that as horrendous as that period was, the Shoah, the Holocaust, it happened 80 plus years ago. It was another time. Somehow, what he basically said in so many words is, since that time, he just believed we had modernized, we had become more educated, we'd become more enlightened, that was something that was a period in history that you can kind of wrap around as something that happened in the past. You should study it. You should remember it. You should learn from it. But it's not actually, it's not something you would see now. And he said, what he saw that day was now. And it was so chilling for him that this kind of hate and genocidal attempt could be living in his lifetime. And I think that's what we're all experiencing. So that's one thing that's so jarring. The second thing I'd say is, one of the themes throughout anti-Semitism, the history of anti-Semitism, is there's two attributes that have always been consistent in the history of anti-Semitism. One is when Jews are attacked, they're always vilified after they're attacked. So it's not like they're attacked and then everyone has this tremendous sympathy. It's that's
what really shook Jews around the world.
Was the reaction.
October 8th was I'm not going to say more frightening, because October 7th was the most horrific day since the Holocaust, but instead of the world putting their arms out and wrapping around us, it was like, what'd you guys do to deserve this?
Exactly. I mean, the way I explain it is, I naively thought after October 7th that the outrage of the world would be directed at those who had massacred Jews. And instead, the outrage of the world was directed at Jews for objecting to being massacred. And that was, but then on the one hand, I was shaken by that. On the other hand, that's a consistent theme throughout the history of anti-Semitism. It was when Jews are attacked, it's followed by vilification. And the second attribute that always persists is exactly what you said, which is not that the Jews are vilified, but it's that Jews had it coming, that they somehow provoked it, that they're blamed for it. And you even saw that, Donny, as recently as last week during this pogrom in Amsterdam, where immediately we are subjected to press coverage of, some Israelis were stomping on a Palestinian flag, or they made some slur.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? Like that, given the slurs and the burning of Israeli flags and the tearing down of hostage posters that Jews have been subjected to over the past year, that no one made a big deal about, which was a big major expression of anti-Semitism. And now suddenly, after there's a pogrom in Amsterdam, some people are saying, well, maybe there were a few Israelis who did. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, am I taking my crazy pills here? Like, this is really the conversation? And when I say that I'm so upset by it, it's because, of course, this is the playbook. Of course, it's so obvious that there was a pogrom in Amsterdam last week. And of course, if you study the history of anti-Semitism, as certain as night follows day, what follows the pogrom is the Jews provoked it.
Incredible. Dan Senor, you are a gentleman, a scholar. The book is the New York Times bestselling book, The Genius of Israel, The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. Must read in this day and age. Thank you, sir.
Donny, thanks for doing this, and keep doing what you're doing. I'm really grateful for it.
Everybody, thanks for watching. If you like it, hit that subscribe button. And we love having you here watching On Brand. And just don't miss any future episodes. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.